After Barbara's introduction of you, Paul, I feel like I need to refer to you as Mr. Chairman, since you have so many chairs, and thanks for the work that you've done with the World Food Prize. Barbara, thank you very much for your continued leadership of this incredible organization. And I see Ambassador Quinn here, who served so admirably in that same position for a while, a few years. And Ken and I, yeah, absolutely. And it is a distinct pleasure to be back to the World Food Prize, to have this opportunity to close the dialogue portion of this week, and looking forward, obviously, to the event tonight, where Dr. Rosenzweig is going to be feted as the next World Food Prize laureate. Someone who dedicated her life to giving us the tools that allow us to make more informed decisions. Do not underestimate the work that she has provided over the course of an incredible career. This notion of modeling, this notion of using of data, I think we are all now catching up to her. And I think you'll see in my remarks a number of intersections between her work and modeling that she's done that has allowed us to advance the work at USDA. And so we are forever grateful for her work. And I really appreciate the theme of this year's dialogue, Feeding a Fragile World, Integrating Mitigation and Adaptation in Climate Solutions. You know, there's a tendency, I think, for us to really focus on this issue of climate change when it comes to feeding the world. We continually see a number of headlines related to the significance of climate change and the impact it could potentially have on our ability to feed an ever-increasing world population. And I think Norman Borlaug said it best. He recognized that the ability to feed people in this world isn't just something that we ought to do, it is a moral calling that all of us need to be engaged in. And as we're engaged in this, as much attention as we spend on climate, and we should, there are other facets and aspects that need to be given some consideration as we talk about this important issue of feeding a hungry world. I think it's important for us to recognize the role that conflict can play, and does play, and is playing today in the world as we try to meet the needs of an ever-increasing world population. I think it is fair to say that people who are in attendance here, the scientists, the people who have dedicated their life to feeding hungry populations, understand and appreciate that food never, ever, ever should be a weapon of war. It is a sad reality today in Ukraine that it's being used as a weapon of war. That ought not to happen, and we as a world community should say very clearly that it's inappropriate. Go ahead. I think we also have to recognize that there is also corruption that plays a role. You know, as we deal with the ability to deliver food aid and assistance, sometimes it is thwarted because of what's going on in country, in areas of conflict, which ultimately results in a delay and possibly preventing food from getting to people who are in need. So I think we as a world community need to understand and dedicate ourselves to a free flow of humanitarian assistance. And obviously, COVID has made and played a role recently in the disruption of supply chains, which has made it somewhat difficult for us to get food where it needs to get to. So as important as climate is, and I'll talk extensively about that today, I want to make sure that I express the concern about the three other C's. And that we as a world community ought to be focused on all four of these with the same level of fervor and passion. So it seems as if the agricultural community has awakened to this notion of climate and climate change. It seems as if farmers are now understanding and appreciating that the market is demanding greater sustainability, and that we are just now sort of recognizing the challenge. But I'm here today to tell you that change doesn't occur in a moment. It occurs over an extended period of time. And this change that we are now recognizing has been ongoing for a long time. Norman often said, take it to the farmers, trust the farmers, understand that they appreciate their responsibility, and if you give them the tools and the understanding, they will respond, and I think that is what is happening. So I'm optimistic about this. I'm extraordinarily optimistic. You know, our journey at USDA in this area started about 10, 11, 12 years ago. I was secretary before, and the team came in and said, we need to establish climate hubs. I didn't quite know what that was. And they explained to me that it was important and necessary for us to begin a process at USDA to divide the United States of America into a series of regions, to recognize that there are geographic differences in each of those regions, there are different crops that are grown in each of those regions, and each of those regions would be impacted and affected by a changing climate in a unique way. And that our responsibility was to make sure that we were researching it, we were understanding it, and we were providing information to farmers as to what was likely to happen over time so that they could begin the process of adapting and mitigating the consequences of a changing climate. So we established these climate hubs, and research and modeling and data become critically important to the role that the climate hubs are currently playing. And they are in fact alerting farmers, and they are in fact giving farmers the tools necessary to begin the process of significant adaptation and mitigation. Now, as these climate hubs were developed, then it obviously became important for us at USDA to establish and to create tools that we need to share not just in the United States, but all over the world. Tools that will allow us the opportunity to give farmers the information, the data, the capacity to understand precisely how climate is impacting and affecting their operation. So we developed things like GraceNet, Greenhouse Gas Mitigation through Agriculture Carbon Enhancement Network. Only in USDA could you have something that long to be able to explain what you're doing. But what this does is it gives farmers the ability to quantify greenhouse gas emissions, gives them the opportunity to take a look at management practices that might alter or affect carbon sequestration, and gives them the ability and the capacity to begin to understand how to measure. Incredibly important. Or Comet Farm, which is the carbon management and emissions tool. This is a tool that essentially allows us to quantify greenhouse gas emissions in the tools that are available at USDA for precision agriculture, and develop a criteria and a measurement of certain practices in carbon management on farms that again allows farmers to be well educated about precisely what they are doing, how they're doing, and the impact of what they're doing. As we develop these and other tools, it gave us the capacity and the confidence to create and to begin to utilize financing mechanisms, to be able to identify climate smart practices, and then to be able to use our conservation programs, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the Conservation Reserve Program, ways in which we could invest, incent, encourage producers to utilize these resources for cover crops, or prescribed grazing, or nutrient management in the 4 Rs, making sure that we were applying fertilizer in the right place, in the right time, in the right rate, and in the right amount. Crop rotations, irrigation systems that were more efficient, and even the establishment and adoption and encouragement of renewable energy production on farms. So these financial mechanisms created opportunities and incentives for individual practices. That allowed us to evolve into where we are today. President Biden's directive to his Department of Agriculture was fairly profound and I think fairly ambitious. He first asked us how could we contribute as agriculture to the Paris Agreement responsibilities of the United States of America. We responded with what we thought agriculture could do. And then he said by 2050 the expectation would be that U.S. agriculture was operating at a net zero basis. This is a transformational moment in agriculture. This is a transformational moment. This is a chance to do a lot of things that need to be done in agriculture, not just on climate, but as well, not just on productivity, as important as that is, but also on profitability. For the last 40 years or so, our focus has been predominantly on increasing productivity. That needs to continue, obviously, if we're going to continue to feed a fragile world in the face of climate change, but we have to make sure that it is also not only sustainable, but also profitable. And so now we have an opportunity. Now in this transformational moment, we have an opportunity to say to agriculture, not just in the U.S., but around the world, there are ways in which we can provide new revenue streams and income sources for farmers as they do what they want to do, as they do what they have been doing, figuring out ways in which they can be compensated for it. So how do you establish that? How do you create it? What do you do to get people to understand the power of this idea? Well, the notion was that we'd first and foremost do what Norman would ask us to do. He said, go out and listen to farmers. Talk to farmers. They'll tell you what they need. Well, here's what we heard. We heard a series of value systems and propositions. They said, look, if you want us to do this in a big way, in an accelerated way, in a comprehensive way, make sure it's led by farmers. Make sure that we're intimately involved in the crafting and designing and the engineering of this. Make sure that it's voluntary, that we're not compelled or forced, but we're encouraged and incented. Make sure that it's market-based. Create opportunities for the market to recognize the significance and importance of the contributions we're making. And trust in science. Allow the science to direct this. Give us the capacity to utilize the science that we know works. And by all means, measure and verify and quantify and certify the results so that we're in a position to reassure the folks who are investing in this that it's working. So we went back after listening and we developed this notion of climate-smart commodities. The idea that indeed there is a market opportunity and a market demand for products that are being produced in a sustainable, climate-smart way. We know that there are practices that work. We know that there are partners and partnerships that can be formed. So we essentially said, what do we need to do? We need to encourage participation by farmers, so there clearly needs to be incentives. We need to measure success so that success can be marketed. We need to reduce the risk to farmers. The fact is farmers are operating on a relatively small margin, in some cases no margin at all. And it's difficult to ask them to embrace new ways and change if there is a cost associated with it, if there isn't a corresponding benefit beyond just the environment. Foster partnerships, and by all means figure out a strategy in a way in which farm income can be increased. So we went to the drawing board. We came back with this notion of climate-smart commodities, and we said, okay, how are we going to pay for it? There's still, within the political world, some reluctance on this, and so we had to even establish the concept, the popularity of the concept to some of our political leaders. So we tapped the Commodity Credit Corporation, which we had authority to do and which farmers asked us to do. We initially identified $1 billion. We divided it into two grant programs, a large grant program where you could request anywhere from $5 to $100 million over a 3 to 5 year period, and a small grant program. And the small grant program was designed to ensure that no one was going to be left out in this process, regardless of the size of operation. We thought that equity was important to be a value that is advanced, that every producer, regardless of size, regardless of what commodity they may be raising, or what livestock they're raising, or what method they use, or what region of the country they come from, should be engaged and involved in this effort. So we invested these resources, we sent out the information, and then we took a big deep breath, crossed our fingers, said a few prayers, and hoped that we were right about the design of this being something that could be embraced. Well, my staff came in at the first deadline for the large grant program, and they said, Mr. Secretary, we have 450 applications. I said, wow, that's great. That's the good news, Mr. Secretary. The bad news is it's $18 billion of requests. We still had the small grant program to come in. A couple weeks later, they came in and they said 600. I said, great, not 150 applications. No, no, sir, another 600 applications. another $2 billion of requests. So we had $1 billion for $20 billion in demand. So we went back to the board, we took a look at how much flexibility we had left in the Commodity Credit Corporation, and we put another $2.5 billion into this effort. So now this is a $3.5 billion effort, and as we got applications from the large grant program, as we made decisions about 70 projects that we decided to invest in, we saw that that was being matched by about $1.4 billion of additional outside commitment. That's on top of what producers are going to do in terms of their labor and their equipment. This is a massive opportunity. All 50 states are engaged. We anticipate and expect that at least 50,000 farmers, and probably more, will participate in these projects, and we have yet to make decisions on the small grant program. We anticipate that every commodity, every livestock group is involved. We know that nearly 25 million acres of land in the United States is going to be engaged in these practices. And we've seen incredibly unique partnerships. Partnerships between conservation groups and environmental groups teamed up with commodity organizations, farm organizations, agribusiness companies, food companies, retailers, universities involved, our land-grant university system, our historic black colleges and universities, our Hispanic serving institutions, our tribal colleges, all engaged and involved in this activity. State and local governments making applications, conservation districts making applications. It's all of agriculture because they see the wisdom of this approach. What's really great and exciting about this is that every single one of these projects, every single one of them, involves a measurement, verification, certification component. So we will be meeting with these projects over time periodically and reporting to the public about what we're learning, what's happening on the ground, what we are doing with these projects. Let me give you a couple of examples of the projects. Organic Valley is an organic dairy industry, the company. It's active all over the country. It's got a lot of producers. What they've decided to do with their project is they've decided to do what is called insetting. So in their pricing, in their support for their producers, they're going to inset, they're going to insert into their support various levels of support based on the capacity of a particular producer to embrace a suite of climate-smart practices. Tyson, it's a major food company, processing company, they're going to be focused on their feed as they are buying chickens, as they're buying hogs. They're going to be looking at how the feed for those animals has been produced and how climate-smart practices can be incorporated in the feed, how they can incent and pay farmers for those activities, and over time transition that incentive into a market-based incentive where the market is helping to pay. So now all of a sudden farmers have a value-added proposition. The U.S. Rice Federation, concerned about methane production in rice, is looking at new irrigation systems that involve an ability to create sort of a furrowed approach and to alternate the way in which water is used in rice production, which could have profound impact not just on rice production in the U.S., but all over the world. Soybean Association, working with producers in the Midwest, looking for ways in which they can provide incentives for climate-smart soy production because they know there is a continued demand for that kind of soy product in the marketplace. And what this will do is it will not only create opportunities for those producers to get that value-added proposition, but in doing so, they will also be able to qualify potentially for ecosystem markets, private sector markets that need certain conservation results that indeed can pay farmers for those results. Not only will farmers be able to access that revenue stream, but many of the projects involve the conversion of agricultural waste into a variety of new products of chemicals, materials, fabrics, and fibers as we transition from an over-reliance on fossil fuels for these materials to a more bio-based future. The notion, for example, in this part of the country, we are very interested, obviously, in continuing to have transportation fuels that are sustainably produced. You know, as I talk to audiences across the country, I say, you know, I understand the electric vehicle thing. I understand it. You know, you get in your car, you charge it up, and if the charge for whatever reason doesn't work, you pull the car on the side of the road, you get out your cell phone, you ask for help. But if you're in an airplane and the battery wears out, how does that work? There's no pulling on the side of the road. You got some serious issues. And the reality is the airline industry understands that. And they know that as they transition ultimately to a hydrogen future, which is many, many decades down the road, or large batteries becoming really small batteries with immense power, they're going to need a sustainable aviation fuel. That industry is a 35 billion gallon industry. That's double the capacity of the current biofuel industry. What an amazing opportunity that this climate smart focus is presenting. And indeed, there is a sustainable aviation fuel component to our climate smart commodity effort. Do you see the amazing transformation that's taken place here? Farmers of all sized operations, all commodities, all regions of the country participating in this, understanding that it's not just the traditional way of making money where you raise crops and sell it, where you raise crops and feed it to something and you sell that something or products of that something. You now have those revenue streams. You have exports, obviously, which are going to be dependent on our ability to say our exports are sustainably produced because that's what the international market wants. The ability to quantify and qualify for ecosystem markets because you have measurable benefits that can be potentially marketed. The opportunity then to convert agricultural waste into something far more valuable. We're learning now that we're probably over-fertilizing some of our land. What do we do with that fertilizer? What if you could convert it into a chemical, into a material, into energy, into fabrics, into fibers? You create new manufacturing jobs in rural places. You create a whole new economy, a bioeconomy. That's the power of what we're talking about here. So as we deal with this notion of a fragile world, just understand, as many as the headlines would suggest that things are dire, there are individual farmers today who are committed to strengthening that world. At least you think this is, oh, well, that's great. This is a one-off program, Mr. Secretary. That's great. You put a lot of money into it. That's nice. But when that money runs out, then what? Well, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act. It has a lot of benefits to it. Reduced health care costs for some folks, senior citizens in particular. But one of the benefits I like in particular is the amazing historic investment in conservation that's included in that bill. We've never seen that kind of investment in conservation ever, ever, ever. And so it's an opportunity for us, as we learn more from this climate smart commodity, to take that nearly $20 billion investment, the Inflation Reduction Act, and to funnel it through our traditional conservation programs to continue to support these practices and to continue the transformation and change that's been taking place over the last decade or more. Now, as great as this is, it only becomes truly great if we're willing to share this information. If we're willing to understand that in the U.S. we have a responsibility not just to our producers, but in a sense we have a responsibility as a leading agricultural producing country to work with our fellow nations, agricultural nations, and encourage them to make the same transformation. I don't see this as a competitive circumstance because the reality is that world population is going to continue to grow. We're going to continue to need more and more and more. We're going to continue to need all kinds of food production and all kinds of agricultural systems, not just the ones that are in rural places, but the ones that are in urban areas, not just animal protein, but also plant protein. There is enough demand and enough opportunity for all of it. So we shouldn't feel concerned about sharing what we learn, which is why the United States, along with the Arab Emirates, United Arab Emirates put together the AIM for Climate effort. AIM for C is what it's called. It started with a handful of countries and a few partners. And the notion was that we would say, hey, how about we try to accelerate the information, accelerate the utilization of these new practices in a way that will advance climate smart, accelerate the use of climate smart. What could we do? We could get some sprint partners. We could maybe invest several $billion and put the focus on this. We now have over 200 partners. We have a multitude of countries. We're going to be able to go to COP27 here in a couple of weeks and be able to talk about the expansion of AIM for Climate and be able to talk as the United States about the Climate Smart Partnership effort, the necessity and need for us to share that information as it becomes available, and put the United States in a leadership position that we ought to always be in my view. And it's not just AIM for C, it's also the Sustainable Productivity Coalition, more than 90 participants in that effort that understands that indeed science, biotechnology, and other science has a role to play in sustainable production, that they are not mutually exclusive. So as I conclude, I hope that despite the challenges, despite the dire headlines that you see, that behind those headlines are folks working at every level of government, in rural areas across this country, on farms and ranches and orchards everywhere in this country, committed to this new transformed agricultural economy. And what this does is it creates an opportunity for us to cooperate. It creates an opportunity for us to collaborate. It's an opportunity for us to communicate. It's an opportunity to make a commitment. In a sense, it's an opportunity to take the individual example of Norman Borlaug and multiply it by millions. What a powerful concept. What a powerful opportunity. And for the United States, what it does is it creates a meaningful pathway for farm owners, for ranchers, to be able to do what they desperately want to do, to sustainably produce quality food, crops, livestock, but to also be able to pass it on to the next generation. It creates the opportunity to develop new industries and expand existing industries in rural communities that allows the value system that is alive and well in those rural communities, on those farms and on those ranches. The notion of taking care of family and taking care of community and taking care of country and doing it proudly, it allows that to continue. So I'm incredibly optimistic about what's taking place today in this country and across the world. I'm incredibly optimistic about the young people that you've heard from and that you've seen during the last 3 or 4 days here in Des Moines, who have this passion to be scientists, who have this passion to do what Norman did. So this is an exciting time, and I hope that everyone leaves this week with a positive, forward-thinking, proactive attitude about agriculture and its future. Because I honestly, truly believe that the most exciting days, the most productive days, the most sustainable days, and the most profitable days for agriculture lie ahead. Thank you very much.